So welcome everyone. I'm thrilled that so many of you are joining today. We had over 500 people register for this, which is incredible. AI is definitely a hot topic, and a lot of folks kind of feel like they know what it is, but not really. It can be a bit intimidating. Most people, when they think of AI, they just think of like ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude or Copilot, but in reality, it is a lot more than that. So my goal here today is to really hopefully move you from feeling intimidated to feeling informed. I'd like for you to feel confident enough to understand what's going on with these tools under the hood. So we're going to just take a sneak peek under the hood of a few of these and hopefully feel empowered to make some more thoughtful decisions about how you're using AI in your academic work. And if you're not familiar with who I am, I'm Dr. Jessica Parker. I'm a healthcare researcher. I am a supervisor of doctoral students at the Massachusetts College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences, where I've done research on generative AI and how it can be used to support aspects of our scholarly work. I also ran an AI ed tech company called Moxie for several years. So I am very familiar with this technology and how it works and what its capabilities and limitations are. And so my experience running Moxie certainly informs my perspective. But if you've heard from me maybe a few years ago and you're just coming back, you may hear a different perspective today. I haven't done a complete 180 in my perspective. I still use AI, but I have become much, much more critical of it. So you'll hear a lot more of that critical lens coming from me today. I also have a podcast that I co-host with Dr. Kimberly Becker, who's an applied linguist. It's called Women Talking About AI, where we feature the voices of women, not just in the AI industry, but who are educators, business leaders, thought leaders. We think it's important to share the perspectives of women because this is often a male-dominated space. So I encourage you to check out that podcast. And I also have a Substack called Women Writing About AI, where we sort of write about lots of different things. And my most recent post was called Reclaiming the Relational, where I reflect on business decisions I have to make as the CEO of Dissertation by Design and the Dissertation Coach, and how I've started to really think a lot differently around decisions surrounding automation and what we're losing, what that trade-off looks like. So you'll see some of that come into today's conversation. And this is how we're going to spend our time together today. We're going to start by getting comfortable with the language of AI. That means unpacking terms that you often are likely to hear, such as machine learning, deep learning, generative AI, large language models. And hopefully by the end of that, those acronyms won't feel as mysterious to you. And then we're going to move into seeing AI clearly. We're going to take a peek under the hood of things to understand how these tools actually learn, generate, and sometimes get things wrong. And then we're going to talk about trade-offs, because every technological leap comes with benefits and costs, and AI is no different. So we're going to look at how convenience, creativity, equity, and accuracy are often in tension. And then finally, we'll close with practicing thoughtful AI use. I'll share a few frameworks and examples that hopefully you feel like you can apply right away in your own academic or professional context. And again, if you have questions that you'd like for me to answer at the end, just go ahead and add those in the Q&A at any time. So before we start defining terms, I want to take a step back and just frame this conversation. I want to ground us all together. When people hear the word AI, reactions tend to be strong. Some feel a lot of excitement, others feel fear. And I think most of us, though, feel a mixture of both. But this webinar today is not about deciding whether AI is good or bad. It's about understanding AI as we would any major advancement. It's complex, it's layered, and it's worth examining from multiple angles. Just like electricity, the internet, or the printing press, AI will be shaped by how we use it as humans. It's not a single invention, it's a collection of evolving tools that reflect our values, biases, and priorities. So rather than asking, is it good or bad, I want us to ask better questions, like what does it reveal about us, about how we think and create and communicate? We're going to start with this framing. I have a few slides on framing the conversation. We're going to start with something that's deeply human, and that's language. If you think about it, language was really the first great technology. It's the original tool that transformed how humans lived and learned. Through language, we were able to share knowledge beyond a single lifetime. We were able to coordinate and cooperate at scale. And maybe most importantly, we could imagine, we could plan for futures that didn't exist yet. And every invention since that, from the wheel to the internet, stands on the foundation of language. It's the core mechanism through which we exchange ideas, make meaning, and build culture. So when we talk about AI today, especially language-based AI like ChatGPT, we're really talking about machines that are learning to use our oldest and most powerful tool, which is our words. Language is our operating system. It's the code that underlies our thoughts, relationships, and our identity. So when we see a technology like a large language model that's learned to master that same operating system through generating words, sentences, and even arguments that mimic the flow of human thought, it can trigger a sense of awe. I know I felt a sense of awe the first time I used ChatGPT 3. I also felt terrified, but it felt like magic. And I know a lot of people have also shared that. And that's because we instinctively associate language with intelligence. When we see a machine using words coherently, our brains interpret that as thinking. But what's really happening is just pattern prediction. It's not consciousness. These systems mirror our collective culture and our reasoning patterns, but they don't actually understand them. But the emotional impact remains very real because when a tool mirrors our thoughts back to us, it really challenges what it means to be human. And so I've had lots of existential crises since I've been doing this work, but it is still pretty profound. Even when I learned about what's actually happening behind the scenes, it doesn't take away that sort of magic of that feeling of working with them. It's also important as we go in today's conversation that you remember that these systems are not neutral. The tools that we call frontier models, such as ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, Copilot, they're all built within this Western capitalistic logic. That means they're shaped by the same values that drive our larger systems, which are efficiency, scale, productivity, and of course, profit. These models prioritize quantity over quality, and they're overwhelmingly trained on English language data. So that means that certain voices, perspectives, and cultural logics dominate the data, while others are completely absent or underrepresented. So even though these systems often sound objective or even global, they actually reproduce the biases that of the creators in the data that have been fed to them. But this doesn't mean that we should reject them. It just means that we should read them critically, as we would any source, asking like, who created this? Just like when I buy a book, I'm wondering who created it. Well, when I use ChatGPT or Claude or any new AI tool, I'm wondering about its creator. What worldview is embedded here and whose voices might be missing? Because if you're not asking those questions, we are risking mistaking computational fluency for universal truth. And that is, I think, where the real danger lies. So now that we understand that AI is both a linguistic and a cultural creation, I want to touch on just the hidden costs that often get left out of the conversation. Because when we talk about tools like ChatGPT, it's easy to imagine something kind of abstract, almost like a digital brain that's floating in the cloud. But in reality, these systems depend on massive amounts of physical infrastructure and human labor. For example, training GPT-3, one of the earlier models, they produced around 502 metric tons of CO2, and that's the equivalent of the annual emissions of over 100 cars. Data centers consume millions of gallons of water every day to cool their machines, and that water often comes from local communities that are already facing scarcity. Electricity demand also raises local power costs. And then behind the AI that you're interacting with, there's thousands of workers who are labeling data, filtering harmful content, and training the models. And many of these people work under what we call digital sweatshop conditions, where there's long hours, low pay, and exposure to disturbing materials. So when we say AI is non-human, that's only partly true. Every model reflects enormous human effort, and it's often invisible effort. But of course, it's not all heavy. There are incredible life-changing applications of AI happening right now. Take AlphaFold by DeepMind, for example. It has completely revolutionized biology by predicting protein folding with incredible accuracy. And that's helping researchers understand diseases faster than ever. We have Path AI that's transforming pathology diagnostics by helping doctors detect cancers and other illnesses earlier. We have NASA's Earth observing AI models that are being used to predict and understand climate patterns. And then during the COVID pandemic, Blue Dot was used to detect and report outbreaks days before the World Health Organization issued its first alert. So these are examples that remind us that AI is a tool. And like any tool, its impact depends on how and why we use it. It can accelerate discovery and it can deepen insight when it is aligned with our human ethics and intention. We've also seen AI used in ways that are manipulative, unethical, and outright harmful. For example, I am appalled by Sora 2, which is a video generation model just released by OpenAI. It's already raised a lot of serious concerns about deepfakes, which are synthetic videos that can mimic real people's voices and faces. Tools like 11 Labs clone voices so convincingly that scammers are already using them to impersonate loved ones and public figures. Then we have AI systems like Predpol, which is a predictive policing algorithm, which has been used to target communities for policing, and they've been shown to disproportionately target marginalized communities. And this introduces a lot of racial and socioeconomic biases into law enforcement data. Another example is the Immigration iOS by Planeteer, a system used to track immigrants' movements. It illustrates how easily AI can move from helpful to invasive when it's deployed without oversight or ethical grounding. So as educators, researchers, and just citizens, I believe that AI literacy becomes a form of digital citizenship so that we can understand not just what these systems can do, but what they should do so that they're aligned with our values. So to just sort of bring us back to the framing before we dive into AI literacy, I just want to remind you that at the heart of today's session is not a conversation about whether AI is good or bad. What I want to do today is demystify it, to question it and understand it, because it is one of the most influential advancements of our time, but it's also one of the most misunderstood. And when something this powerful is misunderstood, that's when misuse can happen, not necessarily out of malice, but often out of ignorance. So our purpose today is to replace that fear with understanding and replace a lot of the hype we're seeing with critical awareness. All right, let's talk about why all of you are here. I know that was a long framing, but I felt that it was important to just ground us all, at least in my perspective. So why AI literacy? That's really what we're here for today. AI literacy is not just using tools like ChatGPT. It's about understanding how they shape the way we think, write, and research, because most of us here today are academics, and deciding how we want to participate in that change. Just think about the early days of the internet, if you remember those days. I'm aging myself. At first, there was a lot of confusion and skepticism and even fear, but over time, we learned to navigate it. We learned to verify sources. Digital literacy became the norm. We learned to separate the credible from the questionable. And AI literacy is just the next iteration of that. It's not about becoming a computer scientist. I'm not a computer scientist. I don't have any formal technical training. It's really just about being an informed and discerning user. Because the truth is that these technologies are already woven into academia and all other aspects of our life, even if you don't realize it. So it's not really a question of will it affect my work, because it already has. It's more about how can I engage with it in a way that aligns with my values and strengthens my scholarship. Here on the screen, I have lots of headlines. There's so much hype out there. It's really quite overwhelming. I want to help you move past some of this hype so that you don't get caught in what's dominating these public conversations, that you can actually start to think about what is happening in your own core activities. So when you see a headline like analyze research papers at human speed, or learn 2x in 2 hours, or use this tool to humanize your AI generated text, hopefully after today's conversation, you'll be able to pause and question the trade-offs that are being made whenever you see these really powerful and sometimes persuasive headlines. And then on this side, you see the spectrum of writing. One end is human writing, on the other is fully synthetic AI generated writing. And in between, we have human in the loop and machine in the loop writing. Human in the loop writing is when the person leads. AI might suggest, but the human is doing all of the filtering, editing, and decision making. And then with machine in the loop writing, AI plays a larger role. It can generate drafts, structures, or even style, while the human curates or polishes. Both models exist on a continuum, and in reality, most of us are already somewhere in the middle. We're used to using grammar checkers like Grammarly, citation managers, summarizer. These are all forms of AI-assisted writing. And so even though you might not have thought about it this way, this is the spectrum that we're starting to see. And you definitely, depending on what you're working on, fall somewhere on the spectrum. But what isn't shown and what is really important is this aspect of agency. Like, who is steering the process? Who is making the intellectual choices? AI literacy is what helps us recognize where we are on that spectrum and gives us the tools to move intentionally, not accidentally, between these modes. Because the danger isn't really using AI, it's just using it without awareness. Depending on what I'm working on, I might have a fully human writing process because I don't want AI to interfere with my problem solving or my critical thinking. But if it's something that's low stakes and repetitive, I may take a machine in the loop writing approach. The point is that this is an intentional decision that I'm making. And hopefully after today, you'll feel more prepared to make those sorts of intentional decisions. So before we talk about the language of AI, I just want to situate us in what AI literacy actually does for us and why we should invest time in it. First, it helps us move beyond hype and fear. So instead of reacting emotionally to every new tool or headline, we can respond thoughtfully and understand it. It also empowers us to reimagine the Academy's core activities. This might mean asking, how can we use AI to make peer review more transparent? How can it help students think more critically and not less? It also shapes public understanding. As educators, our voices matter. We help communities interpret technological change. And when we speak clearly about what AI is and isn't, we elevate the public conversation. And that's what I'm hoping to do today. And then finally, I believe that AI literacy fosters adaptive intelligence, which is simply the ability to thrive amid constant change, because these tools are going to just keep evolving. Just this morning, I revisited a research project I started working on this summer and got derailed from. And what's kind of wild is the models that we were using earlier this summer are completely obsolete. It's only been maybe 3 or 4 months. And that's also the case for the very first study I did on generative AI was using ChatGPT-3. And it creates a major replication issue. Researchers can't even replicate that study because we don't even have access to those models. But because of my investment in really learning and understanding this technology, I'm able to adapt even when the tools and the technology is evolving. Okay, now that hopefully we're all on the same page about why AI literacy matters, I want to start unpacking the language itself because I think the language, the vocabulary that's being used is confusing. So imagine AI, artificial intelligence, as a set of Russian nesting dolls, like I have on the screen here. The largest doll is artificial intelligence. This is the umbrella term. It's just a term for any computer system that does things we usually associate with humans, like learning, planning, solving problems. Siri, if you have an Apple phone, or Amazon's Alexa, is an example of AI that we're all used to by now. And then we have machine learning. These are systems that get better at tasks by looking at lots of examples, kind of like how humans learn through practice. Netflix is an example of a platform that uses machine learning algorithms to recommend your favorite shows or movies based on your history. So it looks at all of that history, those examples of what you like, and then it predicts what you might like, and it serves that up to you in recommendations. We're all familiar with streaming services like Netflix, so machine learning is not new. And then we have deep learning, which simply means that the system can handle a lot more complex information It's a bit like the difference between just basic math and much, much more advanced algorithms. An example of deep learning is like the facial recognition software in your phone, or even how Google can auto tag photos with people based on your contacts. That's an example of deep learning. And then generative AI is the newest evolution of this. This is the ability to create something totally novel and new every time, like text, images, audio, or video, or music. And then we have large language models, which are like a subset of that, which is what we're usually all talking about when we say AI now, which is ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, Copilot. And they are really good at understanding and creating language and helping with things like answering questions, summarizing, synthesizing, lots of writing tasks. Chatbots are really what we're talking about when we're using an LLM. But alas, most people just say AI now, but most of us are talking about LLMs these days when we say that. So let's just start with LLMs, since that's usually what we're talking about, although I'm going to cover more than LLMs today. So a large language model is simply a system that's trained on an enormous amount of text. Think books, articles, websites, academic papers, and it learns the statistical relationships between words. It does not think or understand like we do. Instead, it simply predicts the most likely next word based on a sentence and a pattern that it's seen before. So when we interact with a large language model like ChatGPT or Claude, what we're really doing is giving it a prompt, and it then generates an output that is statistically probable. It's not factually certain. It can be factually certain, but it's not a guarantee. But because it looks so factually certain, it can sound very authoritative, even though it's completely wrong. The magic, and I think the challenge inherent to that, is how human it sounds. Because it's been trained on so much human generated text, it can produce text that sounds and feels fluent and coherent and contextually aware, even though it's not. And this is why AI literacy is so important, because just because something sounds right doesn't mean that it is correct. These systems are just masters of linguistic imitation, not factual truth. And so an LLM doesn't know what it's saying, it just knows how we say things. And then many of us, when you're not going straight to an LLM like ChatGPT, usually we're interacting with what we call a wrapper application. A wrapper is basically a layer that sits around the large language model, and it adds extra features like access to live data, search engines, databases, or even specialized prompts. Moxie, the ed tech company that I had, was an example of a wrapper application. Another example would be Perplexity. If you're using that, it's also a wrapper on top of a large language model. You can almost think of it as like a translator sitting between you and the AI. If you make a request, the wrapper interprets or enhances it, and the large language model underneath generates a response. The wrapper might then go in and check, edit, or supplement that answer before sending it back to you. So when you use a tool like Perplexity, it doesn't just generate text. It searches the web in real time. It filters out sources based on the settings that you choose. So it's not purely predictive like ChatGPT is. It's part search engine, part synthesizer. And I think this distinction is really important. It matters because not all of these tools are created equal. Two platforms might be powered by the same underlying large language model. Like Moxie, for example, we could toggle between ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, depending on the task. The user might not be able to do that or might not know that that's what's going on because they're just interacting with the wrapper application. Similarly with Perplexity, unless something has changed, it pretty much exclusively uses OpenAI LLMs, like the most recent version of ChatGPT, which will be ChatGPT 5 right now. So when you're evaluating one of these wrapper applications, you should be thinking about like, what is under the hood? Am I talking directly to the model, or am I using a system that's shaping its answers in a specific way? And I have an example right here of Perplexity. So I think Perplexity is interesting because it combines two systems, search and language generation. Unlike traditional search engines, which rely mostly on keywords, Perplexity uses semantic search, meaning it looks for context and meaning rather than an exact word match. Once it gathers the relevant results, It uses a large language model like ChatGPT to synthesize those findings into a coherent summary. It's like having a really fast assistant that's good at summarizing, but maybe not necessarily good at evaluating credibility. That's why sometimes you might ask it for academic sources and it could send you to a blog post. That's not really a reputable source. So it's still your job, you're the human in the loop, to verify and interpret. Now, AI agents are somewhat new on the scene, so I want to address that. This is a new slide. An AI agent is a system that can perceive its environment, make decisions, and act toward goals. Perplexity just released their comment browser, which has agents built into it. It's pretty scary how much it can do. This is almost like a digital intern that doesn't just respond when you ask it something, but it makes decisions based on program goals. They're autonomous, meaning they can operate without your full supervision. They're goal directive, so you give them a goal and they're going to work toward achieving that goal. They're adaptive, so they're going to adapt based on what happens in the environment or feedback you provide. And they're also interactive, meaning that they can collaborate with other systems and with humans. And so agents are really the next generation of tools. I don't personally think that chatbots are going to be around. Like, I don't know that we're going to see the chatbots that we do today in a few years. I think agents are going to definitely become the norm. And they can be very convenient, but they can also be a bit unsettling. I was personally testing the comment agent recently because I had heard that students could use the agent to complete all of their work for them by giving it access to their learning management system. And I wanted to see if that was true. So I asked it to complete a goal, and it actually sent a message to my students through the message board, which I did not tell it to do. It was a jumbled message. It didn't even make sense. But that was a little alarming because that was not part of the goal that I gave it, but that really captures its autonomous abilities. It can do things without your full supervision. So it's really important that you fully understand what they're going to do and what they're capable of before you start using an agent. And so if agents are doers, prompts are the instructions we give them. Prompting is just the practice of crafting clear, structured inputs to get better responses from AI systems. So, for example, instead of asking a large language model, like, tell me about climate change, you might get a generic answer. But if you say, act as a climate change expert and explain the issue to a fifth grader, the response is going to be much more tailored and more specific. So, prompting isn't just about getting better output, it's about learning how to communicate to machines more effectively. I also feel like prompting is slightly going away, like the need to be a really good prompter. I know prompt engineering, that was like all the rage initially. And now a lot of these wrapper applications have pretty extensive system prompts built in. So your like prompting skills are not quite as important, but it does capture this sort of age-old computer science principle of garbage in, garbage out. So sometimes the output reflects the input in terms of the prompt that you provide. And oftentimes, because we're human and we have these inherent biases, we can insert bias into our prompts, which is, of course, also going to bias the output. So I think one of the best ways to build confidence in the prompting process is just to experiment with it. I mean, I didn't take a prompting course. I did a study that forced me to get very familiar with what effective prompts began to look like. But even then, that has shifted over time as these models have evolved. I think it's also important to understand what we mean when we say bias when we talk about these models. In AI, bias happens when a system produces unfair or skewed results because of the data it was trained on. For example, an AI essay grading tool might consistently assign lower scores to essays written by non-native English speakers, not because their writing is weaker, but because the training data associates fluency with quality, even if that's not the case. So that's one simple example of bias. I've also seen a lot of conversations around this around Turnitin's AI detectors, which have already been shown to disproportionately target non-native English speakers because its training data doesn't reflect the same patterns of writing. And so it recognizes that as something is off, and it'll give it a higher AI-generated score. Or you could also think of like a resume screening algorithm might prefer male applicants for leadership roles simply because most of the historical data it was trained on reflected male-dominated industries. So these systems aren't intentionally biased, they're reflecting patterns that are existing in their training data. And because as humans, we're inherently biased, they've learned from us. So they're a bit of a mirror in that sense. So the takeaway is that bias doesn't just exist in humans, it's encoded into our data, and these models have learned on that data. And so AI literacy is going to help us detect it, question it, and hopefully correct for it as much as we can. So every time you ask, like, what data is this trained on, or whose voices might be missing here, that is AI literacy in action. That's you thinking about bias, and that's really important. This term hallucination has come up a lot, so I want to define it and discuss it here. In AI, hallucination is happening when a system generates completely false or just misleading information, but usually it often sounds completely believable because it's very confident. For example, most people think of citations. That is the most common form of hallucination we talk about in academia, where it'll give a source that doesn't exist, or it'll misrepresent a historical event with a fabricated detail. And it'll do it with perfect grammar and perfect tone that sounds authoritative. So it's easy for us to miss it. But these happen because large language models are not going into their database and retrieving facts. They're just predicting the next word. They're mathematical models of communication. So when a gap appears in its knowledge, the model fills it with the most statistically likely next text, not verified truth, just the probability of what's most likely the next word or the next phrase. The problem is that as humans, we're conditioned to trust fluency. And when something sounds confident and is well written, we assume it's correct. And that's why your critical thinking skills are more important than ever. We need to rely on our ability to verify, triangulate, and fact check more than ever with these AI systems. So here's a simple rule I like to share. If it sounds too confident, double check it. And that ends up almost always being the case. The best AI users are the ones not who believe everything, they're the ones who verify everything strategically. Okay, and finally, I want to touch on tokens, and then we're going to move to the next section. So tokens are just the fundamental units that AI language models process. They're essentially just pieces of words. In English, one token typically represents about 4 characters, although this can vary. So for example, Wayne Gretzky's quote, "You miss 100% of the shots you don't take," is 11 tokens. Tokens are counted on the input and the output. So if you're starting a text, a new thread in ChatGPT, and you upload a 50-page document, and then you engage in a conversation for 30 minutes, every time you submit a question or a query or a prompt, it goes back to the beginning, and all of that input counts again. So it can get really expensive in terms of tokens. The more you engage within a single chat, we had this issue at Moxie where people would upload an entire dissertation and immediately run out of tokens and get very upset because they did not fully understand what was happening on the back end. And so the way that we measure the units are just called tokens. So every action performed, input and output, takes tokens, and that costs money and energy. Okay, so we've touched on a lot of vocabulary. Now we're going to go to the next section on seeing AI clearly, because by now, hopefully you know that these models don't just store information in neat little folders like a database. They've absorbed patterns across millions, billions, often billions of words. So when you ask AI to explain something, it's not retrieving a fact from memory, it's constructing an answer in real time, word by word, based on the most statistically probable next token. And that means every single sentence is a fresh act of prediction. And so we're going to go over all of the capabilities and limitations associated with that. Let's start by looking at how these models learn and create. So on the left-hand side, we have the data that goes in, the input. This is everything from text and images to code, articles, and conversations. Basically, all the raw material on the internet is what the model learns from. The key thing to know is that the quality of this data really matters. And if the internet is messy, which it is, then that messiness gets reflected in what AI learns. So of course, we need to have a training process. And this is where the model, like ChatGPT, studies millions or billions of examples of the data that went into it, and it learns patterns. It doesn't memorize exact facts. It learns from relationships between words, how words and ideas connect. You can think of it as teaching the model how to fill in the blanks in a way that makes sense statistically. And then, of course, on the right, we have the output. These are the words, images, or ideas that the model generates. It's not pulling from the database or quoting a source. That's why plagiarism is not possible with these models. You can't cite ChatGPT as an author. You can't also go back and ask it the same question and get the exact same output. So you can't correct any sort of plagiarism accusation you've received. This is why, like, Sarah Eaton is a scholar on academic integrity and post-plagiarism. And she argues, and I agree, that we are now in like a fully post-plagiarism era. I don't have time to dive into that today, but I highly recommend checking out her work if you're not familiar with it. So in short, data goes in, patterns get learned, and new content comes out. I know this is very simple, and there's a lot that goes into the training that's very technical that we don't need to go into today. But I think this also really captures all of the things that can go wrong with the input if it's just scraping everything from the internet, not to mention the ethical implications, which I also don't have time to get into today. When we look at this in a very practical way, think of it as this. If you go into a large language model like ChatGPT and you just type in the color of the sky is blank, it's most likely going to predict that the next word should be blue, because that's the most common way to finish that sentence in the training data. So it's just making a prediction that the next word is blue. But if you were to go in and add some additional context, like it's raining today, or it's cloudy, the color of the sky is blank, it's going to consider that additional information you provided, and that's going to shift its prediction. So it might then predict that the sky is gray if you say that it's raining. So that information that you provide is really important to getting the output you're looking for. And when we think about this in an academic setting, because this is what a lot of novice users get wrong, is they'll try to use ChatGPT for research. Even though it is connected to the internet now, it wasn't in the beginning, and it's getting better, it still fully hallucinates sources. So if you were to type in this phrase related to environmental studies, such as study links bee decline to greenhouse emissions, the model is going to generate text based on similar studies and existing literature based on its training data. However, it might just make something up, like Smith et al. 2024, because it believes that's the most likely citation for that statement, even though it might not be even remotely close to the truth. And so I do not recommend using these models for citing sources and for finding literature. There are AI tools out there like Elicit and Cite and Litmaps that were designed, they're wrapper applications, but they were designed just for the purpose of identifying literature. And they are much more effective than a large language model. And then, of course, I think it's important to understand what people mean when they talk about the black box nature of large language models. This really refers to our lack of understanding of how they arrive at specific conclusions, and we're not able to pinpoint their exact thought process. We can't just open up the model and say, oh, this is how it came to that conclusion. Even the developers of these models call it a black box because it's not fully clear how and why it always arrives at a certain decision or output. So even though we're feeding it all these examples and it's learning from those examples, and it's categorizing them, we're going through the training process, we still can't go in and pinpoint any sort of specific decision-making process, and it's pretty opaque. So that's why it's called a black box. I'm just going to skip over this slide because it's driving that point home. We're running out of time. Okay, so now that we've kind of looked under the hood, if you will, I want to quickly touch on trade-offs. Because when we're using these tools, we are making trade-offs, even if you're not realizing it. Because these tools can draft, summarize, analyze, and even teach. But for every gain, something else shifts. We can gain speed, but we risk losing something else. Sometimes that's reflection. Sometimes that's privacy. Sometimes it's critical thinking. This doesn't mean that you should avoid it. It's a reason just to actually approach it intentionally. I've actually completely shifted my process for using large language models now that I've learned more about these trade-offs and really taken a deep dive into the literature, because I am very concerned about losing my critical thinking skills by cognitively offloading too much to a large language model. So over the next few slides, we're going to explore some of these trade-offs and tensions, not to scare you, but just to really help you see the full picture. And this is the hidden trade-off that's often happening. When we get all of this speed and volume, because you can use a large language model to produce text instantly, often in endless quantity, unless of course you run out of tokens. But in exchange, what are we losing? Oftentimes we're losing nuance and specificity. Sometimes we're losing the truth because it's inaccurate, it's hallucinating. So it's important that you keep this in mind whenever you see these headlines like analyze papers at research human speed or find and understand the best science faster. Like oftentimes that speed, we're trading that off for something else. And it's just important to be aware of. So let's touch on one important trade-off, which is speed versus depth. You can produce a paragraph, a summary, or even an entire essay in seconds. And yes, that might feel incredible, but that speed can short circuit learning. When we offload too much cognitive effort to the machine, we lose the slow process that makes knowledge stick. Reflection takes time, synthesis takes time. Writing is a form of thinking. It deepens my thinking. I know that that's true. And it's where we begin to build our understanding. So AI can make us lazy. It can make us efficient at the wrong things if you're not intentional. Because academic work, intellectual work is meant to stretch us. It's meant to frustrate us a little. It's not supposed to be easy to get a master's degree or a PhD or to do original research. It's hard. And so if we're trying to shortcut that or mistake that shortcut for the path, you are going to lose something in the end. So you need to really think about, what is this task? What am I trying to accomplish? Who is this going to benefit? And am I willing to sacrifice this depth for this speed? Sometimes the answer is yes. If it's a repetitive task, if it's low stakes, it might be perfectly fine. But it is often a trade-off you're making, even if you don't realize it. And then, of course, another trade-off is access versus equity. On the surface, AI feels like it democratizes knowledge because anyone now with an internet connection can access and produce knowledge at the click of a button. But then there's this idea of equity, because that doesn't automatically equal equity. The vast majority of training data for large language models is in English. It's often Western, elite, and commercially visible voices that dominate those data sets. There's even a framework I've seen called WEIRD, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. That really reflects the data that is within these frontier models. And so the issue is that we're missing the worldviews, values, and assumptions that are not within that data, within the localized cultures that are often missing from these data that are being used in frontier models. So even tools that are labeled as open or free, they often rely on invisible labor, whether it be underpaid annotators in the global south, or users whose data is being collected without their consent. There's been a huge uproar around copyright issues. There's a lot of lawsuits. So all of that is actually really important to keep in mind, because true equity doesn't mean asking like who gets to use the tools. It's also like whose voices are built into the tools themselves. If we're not aware of that imbalance, we risk confusing technological inclusion with epistemic fairness, and those are not the same thing. I think this next slide partially makes this point. We've probably all heard the phrase, there's a gap in the literature. But with AI, we're starting to ask, like, is there a gap in the literature or a gap in the database? In other words, if AI can't find something, does that mean it doesn't exist, or simply it wasn't included in the training data? The screenshot here shows the disciplines represented in Semantic Scholar's database. Semantic Scholar is open access, and it has millions and millions of papers in its database, and it's used on the back end of many of these AI literature review tools. But most people don't realize that every discipline is not equally represented in the database. So when you look at the literature represented, 60 million papers are uncategorized, so we don't know what disciplines those are. And then if you're like Kimberly, my co-host of my podcast, and we do all of our AI research together. She's a linguist. She's all the way down there on the right-hand side. Only 1.1 million papers in Semantic Scholars database represents her discipline. So is it a gap in the literature or is it a gap in the database? Which is what I point out exactly on this slide. I was actually meeting with someone a few weeks ago who was using Cite AI to find papers related to education. And Cite AI is primarily for medical and biomedical research. So educational type papers for the field of education are not represented in its corpus, its database. So when they said, oh, there's nothing here, I was like, I'm pretty sure you're using the wrong AI literature review assistant. So if you're saying there's a gap in the literature, you need to make sure that's true and you're not just using the wrong tool. Then we also have personalization versus privacy. This is another tension or trade-off. AI tools, they are becoming more tailored to us. Many of these models have what we call memory, where you give it permission to remember things about you so it can tailor its output. They remember preferences, suggest next steps, and adjust tone or content automatically. And it can feel very convenient and even very magical, but that personalization depends on profiling. Every customized experience is powered by data collection about what you click, what you type, how long you linger on a page. Behind every smart recommendation is a trail of behavioral data that is captured, shared, and sold. So the trade-off might feel subtle, but it's actually pretty serious. More convenience often means less consent. So in educational settings, this raises a lot of ethical questions like who owns the data being generated by students who are using AI tools? How is that information being stored? And also, how is it being monetized? I was recently doing some digging into this new AI school that's popping up in the US. I won't say the name of it because I don't want to get in trouble. Um, but they're popping up in the US, and I did some digging into the background and noticed that like a subsidiary of the school is developing their own commercial AI learning platform. And it really seemed like they were beta testing it with students in these schools. And there was a lot of information about how all the monitoring that was going on was being logged in a database and sold to third-party vendors, which were not named, but I'm pretty sure it was the one of the subsidiaries which is producing the technology. So I don't know if the parents of those children are realizing that their students are likely beta testers for a technical product that's going to make a lot of money. And so as you're exploring these AI platforms, I want you to get curious about the fine print. Like what permissions are you granting? Where is your data going? And what is the company doing with it? They're almost always selling it. And most of us don't realize that. And then another tension is, honestly, it's a bit ironic, creativity versus conformity. AI is often described as a creativity tool, and in many ways it is. It can help you brainstorm ideas, generate prompts, even remix styles in ways that can spark inspiration. I know in some ways it's made me more creative, but then there's the paradox. These models imitate creativity through repetition. So they learn from what already exists, which is the average of human expression and not the edges of it. And then we're relying on it to create something new. And so when we rely too heavily on AI to create, we risk training ourselves to think like the average. The outputs become fluent, but formulaic. They become polished, but also very predictable. So the challenge then is not to let AI smooth out our creative rough edges. It's to spark ideas, but also challenge you to keep the courage to sound different, to write badly, to explore the unknown. Like, don't lose that originality in your voice, in your style, in your thinking. And then the final trade-off I'm going to touch on, which might be the most familiar, is efficiency versus accuracy. Like, I think most of us who use AI love the efficiency it can bring, but there is a catch. When something feels effortless, we often stop interrogating it. As I've said multiple times now, large language models are optimized for fluency, not truth. That means they produce fluent errors, text that sounds confident and well written, but may be factually wrong or subtly misleading. And the risk here isn't just misinformation, it's the gradual erosion of our own critical thinking muscles. That is what most educators, including myself, are very concerned about. Because when the machine sounds more certain than we feel, it's tempting to defer to the machine, especially when you're a student and you typically see this really authoritative sounding text in journal articles written by real researchers, where the research has gone through the peer review process, and now you're interacting with an LLM that outputs material that you might pass off as your own that is also just as authoritative as what you might read in a journal. Then it can be tempting to defer to that output, and that is not the way to go. So how can we leverage its speed without sacrificing our intellectual rigor? That is the question. I don't have the answer to it, but I know that this idea of being critical is a step in that direction. So I wanted to just provide one example of what we prioritize with efficiency. So Cite AI is an AI research assistant. It's like a literature review tool. It uses Semantic Scholar as well as it has agreements with different publishers in the medical and biomedical field. So when you use it, you can ask it a question like, does social media impact mental health? And what it's going to do is go pull the literature in the database. It's going to output this sort of mini literature review, mini synthesis. And this is exactly the type of output and fluency that you would see in a journal article. So the initial response is that it is real and truthful and believable and credible. But the reality is it's not. And this isn't just Cite, this is any of these AI literature review assistants. Even Google's AI summary that comes back looks very fluent like this as well. But if you really dig into a lot of these citations, there are issues. I'm just going to point out a few of them. One is what we call certainty amplification. This occurs when tentative findings are gradually becoming more presented as established facts. So something that begins in the literature as initial evidence suggesting something, so it's not a strong, confident finding, can evolve in the AI generated output as something much more confident sounding, such as research indicates or studies have established. So this progression adds layers of certainty that weren't present in the original work. And this certainty amplification is evidenced in this paragraph, not in the finding itself, and you don't need to read through this right now, but when you think about the finding on top of other findings. So the language that's being used, like similarly, Lee 2024, this is further supported by, and then it gives another study. When we actually went in and looked at these individual sources, we noticed that these studies were actually doing very different things in different contexts. They don't really build on each other in the way that they're being presented here. And that is an example of certainty amplification. I'm looking at the time. We're almost out. I'm sorry. I have so much. I only have 2 more slides. So our final section is on practicing thoughtful AI use. So up until now, we've explored what AI is, how it works, what the trade-offs are, and now I want to just give you 2 really simple frameworks that you can use to implement in your practice. One is called the AI sandwich framework. I developed this a few years ago, and I had no idea it was going to catch on. People love it. I think it's because it's so simple. This is what I use with my doctoral students. I let my students use AI, but I want them to use it in this way if they're going to use it. I allow them to go to the AI to brainstorm and ideate. So if you're working on a lit review and you're wondering, oh gosh, should I structure my lit review according to these themes, or should I follow this like problem, cause, solution order? You could explore that with a large language model, those different outline structures. But then you go off and you write the lit review yourself. You triangulate it with your traditional methods. You do what you did before these AI tools existed. But then you can go back to the AI and you can ask it to provide formative feedback to guide your revision. So for example, I know that I have a tendency to write in passive voice. So part of my review process is I have AI give me feedback on my passive voice. And that is part of the formative feedback process. And so it's not just uploading your lit review and saying, give me feedback. You need to be aware of what your own tendencies are in your writing so you can ask for really specific feedback. I will just warn you, oftentimes will give you a very glowing review. So oftentimes I will come up with very specific examples of things that I already know are of issue and point those out. It's definitely not perfect. So if it tells you everything looks good, you should definitely question that. But again, this is a really simple framework that I think can guide your use that people seem to really like. And then here's something that's a little bit more complex, but I also think it's helpful. It's called the 3 E's: effective, efficient, and ethical. And there's a spectrum here, and I'm not going to read all of this out loud. I'll just point out a few. So, effective, like if you're thinking of using AI, I want you to think of it in this way. Like if you're going to let it handle it, it should be only when the task is mechanical or low stakes, like grammar. You should do it yourself if you need to demonstrate critical thinking or original analysis. With efficient, because again, these are trade offs, do it yourself if you need to build the essential skills to develop the product, like writing or problem solving. But you could let AI handle it if the tasks are repetitive and time consuming and don't contribute to the learning goals. I think of like APA 7 as an example of this, formatting my references. Ethical, do it yourself if AI is prohibited. So again, I'm not your instructor or your professor or your program director. So if it's prohibited, follow those rules. Don't violate any policy. If you're not sure, always ask. But ultimately, if you're using it in an intentional way, if you're citing your use of it or disclosing it, you can't cite it as an author, but you can disclose how you're using it in your process, then that is a way that can support your own development and literacy. So I encourage you to just look at this table in a little more detail when you have time. And then that's it. I ended right at 1 o'clock. That was a lot of information. You are welcome to reach out to me at the Dissertation Coach. I do free consults if you need support or if you have questions. As I mentioned in the beginning of this webinar, I am going to send out the recording and the slides afterward. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and answer some questions. So if you want to stay for a bit and ask questions or listen to my responses, I welcome you to do so. Okay, the questions are about recordings. Yes, I will be sharing the recordings and the slides in an email later today. Thank you, everyone. I'm so glad that you were able to attend. And like I said, you can reach out to me through the Dissertation Coach if you have any follow-up questions, or just respond to my email later whenever I send you this recording.